There are a number of different ways to create sequences. So the first way I'll show you is to simply go to the end of a sequence, and while you're there, come up to Storyboard and then New, and then click on New Sequence, and you'll see that there is a new sequence in between this sequence, which is sequence 1, and this sequence, which is sequence 2. This new sequence is labeled sequence 1A. If I were to start adding panels or adding scenes, it's all to a new sequence, which is sequence 1A. You can also add a new sequence by going up to the Storyboard toolbar and choose this button that is labeled New Sequence. As far as where to put that new sequence, just basically look on your timeline and find the space where you want your new sequence to appear, and then click on the panel that's just prior to that. Now I'm going to come up to the toolbar, click New Sequence, and a brand new sequence has dropped in between sequence 3 and sequence 4. So if we take a look at sequence 3 up in the panel view, we can see that it's sequence 3. And now this new one has been automatically labeled sequence 3_A, and the one that comes after still remains sequence 4. So basically the program has figured out a new name to create so that all of my sequences will remain in sequence. It's possible to activate that new sequence command when you're in the middle of a sequence, but what you should know is that anytime you create a new sequence, it's going to put it right after the end of the current sequence. So just to show you what would happen if I were here in the middle of the sequence and I try to add a new sequence, it will do it, but it's going to place it at after the end of the current sequence. So if you want to break up a sequence, there are a couple of different ways to do that too. Let's say that I want to break up this current sequence, and because this diagram is really different than these scenes that follow that demonstrate the numbering. So the way that I'm going to break these scenes apart is to select a panel, and the location of this panel that I want to select is immediately after the gap that I'm trying to create. So if I want a gap here, I'm going to select this panel. If I wanted to have a sequence break here, I would select this panel. I'm going to go back to here because I want to create a sequence break between those two, and I'm going to click Storyboard and then split current sequence. Alright, it asks me to name it, so it keeps things in order. I'm going to take the name it suggested, but you can see now that I was able to split the sequence. So the key is just to remember that you're going to split the sequence before the current panel that you have picked. To separate out this grouping of panels, I want to make this scene, for example, its own sequence. I'm going to right click in any one of the panels and then click New Sequence from Selection. I'm going to click on that, and it has broken off this entire scene into its own sequence. You can see that this was sequence 3, I'm in sequence 4 now, and this is sequence 5. It's possible to create a sequence out of scenes that are already in other sequences. So let's take a look here just to be real sure about what these colors represent. Is this blue here is one current sequence. This blue bounding box represents a different sequence with a gap in between. This is scene 10 with a gray bounding box. This is scene 11 with the black bounding box. So we can see two different scenes within one sequence, and here's one scene within one sequence. So what I'm going to do now is just by selecting panels in these scenes, I'm going to be able to create a new sequence out of the scenes that I am selecting. First of all, I can just click on one scene within this sequence, and make it its own sequence. So I've made a selection, I right click, go to new sequence from selection, and now it always does this by keeping the scene intact, but now this scene of the dog standing in front of the buildings is its own sequence, whereas before it used to be attached to this scene too. So I'm going to press undo for that, and now we can see it the way it was, which is that this downtown scene, you can see it in the thumbnails, was attached to this little meadow scene before. And I can see this panel seems to be in the wrong sequence, so I'm actually going to be able to move it and attach it back to a different sequence. But there's more on how to move panels and scenes in a different video. But I can also select two different panels from two different scenes and then pull those out to make its own sequence. And when I do that, it is going to pull the entire scene with it. So it's going to take all of scene 11 and all of scene 13, keep those scenes intact, but group those two scenes in a brand new selection. So the way I've done that is by selecting one panel and then holding down the Shift key to select another panel in a different scene. Another way of selecting, before I do this, is you can kind of marquee across two panels if you'd like to. There's a third way to select, which is to click one panel to select it and then hold down the Control key or the Command key on a Mac and click a second panel, and now you have a couple different panels selected. I'm going to right click on that and go to New Sequence from Selection, and it has grouped together these unlikely scenes together into one sequence. One sequence made up of two scenes, scene 11 and scene 13.